It was a sound they'd never heard before. The women, once soldiers of the Empire, huddled in the dimly lit American prison camp, their faces drawn and wary. They had been told to expect harshness, cruelty even, but not the strange laughter of a camp band in the distance, an oddity that drew their attention. As the first notes of country music floated through the camp, it was met with scoffing. The rhythm felt out of place, its simplicity almost comical. They were, after all, warriors of an ancient code, raised on the precision of martial music, not the foot-stomping, heart-wrenching twangs of this American genre. But when they were handed the guitars, when they were invited to play, the dismissive laughter began to fade. There was something infectious about the music. It stirred something in their hearts. The call to adventure had come in the form of a song, one they never expected to answer. For weeks, the women had been held in that foreign, suffocating place where the reality of captivity felt more like an endless nightmare than an unexpected turn of fate. They had arrived with their heads filled with warnings and assumptions, all of them deeply rooted in the myths they had been fed about their captors. The Americans, they had been told, were brutal, dehumanized creatures driven only by their thirst for vengeance. Nothing about them was to be trusted. And then, in the midst of this grim landscape, a strange sound began to float into their makeshift barracks. The sharp, twangy strains of a guitar, a sound so foreign to them it felt almost like an insult. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, but lacked the power they were accustomed to in their homeland. This music seemed clumsy to their ears, almost comical. The deep, mournful wail of the voice that followed only added to the absurdity. How could this be music? How could this be something the soldiers, the enemy, chose to fill the air with? It was simple, rough, and unrefined. Some of the women laughed, unable to contain the disbelief at what they were hearing. The very idea that their captors would subject them to such a sound was almost laughable. This was the music of the uncivilized, they thought. No precision, no discipline. It was nothing like the organized, formal rhythms of military music, which they had always considered an expression of strength and honor. What were they to make of this? How could they take anything seriously from the people who had defeated their homeland? It became another small piece of evidence in the larger puzzle of the enemy they had been taught to fear. Yet, the more they listened, the more that initial mockery started to fade. One of the soldiers had caught sight of the women's indifference and decided to offer them a chance. A simple invitation. Would they like to try the instruments for themselves? It was so unexpected, so utterly foreign, that they could not resist. It wasn't the typical order or demand they had come to expect. It was an offer of choice, however small. The first few moments were awkward. Some of the women hesitated, fingers twitching nervously at the unfamiliar instruments, unsure of how to proceed. They had been trained for battle, not for music. Their lives had been consumed by orders, discipline, and conformity. Yet here they were, holding guitars and banjos, unsure whether to strum or to laugh. The initial awkwardness, however, soon gave way to something else. Slowly, they started to understand the simplicity of the rhythm, the melodies, the shared experience that the music invited them to explore. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered, and it began to draw them in, gently at first, then more deeply. In the days that followed, the initial mockery began to shift. What had once seemed like an oddity, something to mock, began to feel like an escape. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the women found themselves laughing, not out of disdain, but out of genuine joy. The sounds, once strange, now began to evoke feelings they had long suppressed: longing, loss, hope. Perhaps the Americans, so different in every other way, were not so alien after all. They, too, knew what it meant to endure hardship, to find solace in music, in something as simple as a guitar string vibrating through the air. Music became the first step in the women's transformation. It wasn't just a break from the suffocating reality of their captivity. It was a chance to rediscover themselves. They began to reclaim pieces of their identity they had lost to the war. As they strummed and hummed, they slowly started to understand that the music, with its raw simplicity and emotional depth, was more than just a distraction. It was the beginning of something they hadn't even known they needed, a way to express emotions they hadn't been able to articulate, a means to reclaim their humanity. Each note felt like a small rebellion against the fear and distrust they had carried for so long, and with each song they began to feel the walls of the prison, both physical and mental, begin to crumble. At first, it was awkward, like fitting square pegs into round holes. When the soldiers had handed them the instruments, the women hesitated. Their fingers brushed the strings uncertainly, as if the guitars might bite them, or the banjos might crack under their touch. For so long they had been trained for conflict, for survival, for nothing more than the endless grind of war. Music had never been part of their world. They had been raised to believe that honor and strength came from strict discipline, not from such frivolous pursuits. The guitars in their hands felt like a betrayal, as though each strum might somehow diminish their identity as warriors. But the soldiers hadn't asked them to perform. They had only offered a chance, something so small, so unexpected, that the women could not ignore it. With skepticism, the women began to play, their fingers awkwardly pressing down on the strings, the sound clumsy, discordant. The music was a joke at first, something to laugh at, to mock. Yet, as the days passed, the women began to realize that they had misunderstood the gift they had been given. This wasn't about performing for anyone. It wasn't about proving anything. It was a chance to connect. And as much as they tried to push that thought away, it started to take root. The music became something else, something far more important than a silly game or a distraction from the endless waiting. As they fumbled through the notes, something within the women began to shift. They played and replayed the simple tunes, growing more comfortable with each attempt. The music slowly became a language that transcended their fear, their distrust, and the deep scars of war that they had carried for so long. Country music, with its raw emotions and mournful lyrics, spoke to them in a way that words had failed to do for months. The simple chords echoed something inside them: longing, loss, pain. It was as if the music had found the words for the feelings they had not yet acknowledged. They began to understand that the songs were more than just notes on a page. They told stories of resilience, of surviving despite the odds, of enduring hardship with nothing more than hope to hold on to. In the stories of love lost, of home remembered, and of dreams shattered, the women began to recognize their own experiences. Each line of a song was like a mirror, reflecting their journey of survival, their struggle to stay human in the face of dehumanizing captivity. Slowly, as they played, they understood that this music, which had once felt alien, was now an unexpected form of communication. It was the thread they needed to weave their experiences into something they could understand, something they could share. The shift from mockery to curiosity was gradual, but it was undeniable. At first, some of the women had refused to take the instruments, unsure if it was some kind of trick, a way to make them feel small or foolish. But as the weeks passed, they began to play together, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as they realized how the music helped them process their emotions. It wasn't just about the notes anymore. It was about what the music made them feel. It was their way of confronting their captivity, of expressing their sorrow, and of finding something that transcended the pain of their circumstances. Each song became a little ritual, a shared moment where the war could be momentarily forgotten. And through the music, something deeper began to happen. The women began to bond, not just over their shared suffering, but over the unexpected power of the music. They shared a look when they hit the right note, laughed together when they fumbled, and grew stronger as a group with every passing day. The songs, once clumsy and foreign, became their shared story. In that space, they were no longer just prisoners. They were women who had found a way to reclaim their dignity, their voice, and their connection to one another. This was no longer just about surviving captivity. It was about something greater. It was about reclaiming the self, about the quiet power of transformation through music. As the days turned into weeks, the women's music took on a new depth. What had begun as awkward strumming and tentative notes transformed into something far more profound, something that reached into places they hadn't known existed. The country music, with its simple melodies and raw, emotional honesty, became a mirror reflecting not just their current suffering, but the lives they had lost. With each strum of the guitar, memories began to surface. Memories of families left behind, of homes destroyed, of lives once lived in peace before the brutal chaos of war shattered everything. The themes in the songs, homesickness, longing, loss, struck a chord deep within them. They hadn't expected it. The music, so alien at first, now echoed their own experiences as though the lyrics had been written for them, for this very moment. One song, in particular, spoke of a homecoming that would never happen. Another sang of a loved one lost, never to return. As they played, some of the women found themselves pausing, their eyes welling with tears. They hadn't cried in so long. The war had taught them that tears were a weakness, that emotion was something to be suppressed. But now, in the quiet sanctuary of the camp, the music gave them permission to feel again. It was as if the songs were giving voice to the grief they had buried deep inside. The memories that flooded back were not always welcome. Faces from their past, loved ones who would never return, and moments of peace now long gone felt almost like a betrayal. But the music didn't demand that they suppress these memories. Instead, it offered them a way to hold on to them, to honor the lives they had once lived, even if they could never go back. The songs became a bridge, a path back to those moments of joy and simplicity before the war had stolen everything from them. It was painful, yes, but it was also a relief. To remember was to reconnect with their humanity. As they continued to play, the women began to connect with one another in ways they hadn't before. They had shared a common enemy, yes, but now they shared something deeper, a bond forged through the act of remembering. Their individual stories of loss and survival began to interweave, and in that process, the camp became something more than a place of imprisonment. It became a space of solidarity. They no longer saw themselves as isolated individuals trapped in the same cage. They saw themselves as a collective, a group of women who had suffered in different ways, but who had found a means to connect through the music. The music was not just a distraction. It was a bridge between their experiences. For some, it was the sound of home, a fleeting reminder of a time before the war. For others, it was an outlet for anger, a way to express the pain of losing everything. And for all of them, it became a tool for healing. They began to find solace not just in the music itself, but in the act of playing together. As they played, their differences began to fade. Their varied backgrounds, their distinct personal histories, all became less important. What mattered now was the shared experience of survival, of loss, and of the collective strength they found in one another. Through song, they began to heal. The pain of their past, the grief of their losses, and the trauma of war all found expression in the music. It was a slow process, but each note played, each song sung, was a step toward reclaiming a part of themselves they thought was lost forever. The camp, once a symbol of confinement and fear, became a space for emotional recovery. In the music, they found something they hadn't expected, a way to fight back against the war's brutality, not with weapons, but with the strength of their shared humanity. The healing was not immediate, nor was it complete. But through song, the women began to reclaim pieces of themselves they had thought were buried beneath the weight of war. What had once been a foreign, laughable sound now became their anthem, a song of survival, of resilience, and of the possibility of healing, even in the most unexpected of places. Yet the act of playing together continued to transform the women in ways they hadn't expected. What started as a tentative exploration of a foreign sound had now blossomed into something much more powerful. With each passing day, their confidence grew. No longer were they fumbling with the instruments, unsure of their own abilities. The music, once awkward and strained, now flowed more easily from their fingertips. Their hands became surer, the chords clearer, and the melodies more harmonious. The once unfamiliar tunes, laden with themes of loss and longing, began to reflect something else entirely: strength. The women began to realize that the music wasn't just a way to pass time, it was a tool to reclaim something they had lost, their dignity. They began to perform, first just for one another. It started simply, small gatherings of women sitting together in circles, playing the same songs they had learned. But slowly, something changed. They began to take pride in what they were doing. Each note played, each song sung, was a small victory. The sound of their instruments filled the camp with something other than the usual tension and silence. The air, once heavy with fear, began to hum with something new: possibility. They had become creators. No longer were they just prisoners, trapped behind barbed wire. They were artists, expressing their emotions, their stories, and their strength through music. One afternoon, they decided to perform for their fellow prisoners. It was a hesitant first step, unsure of how their audience would respond, unsure of how they themselves would perform. But as they stood together, instruments in hand, something shifted. They began to play, and the air around them seemed to change. The other women, the prisoners who had shared their grief, their exhaustion, and their suffering, began to listen. At first, they sat in silence, unsure what to expect. But then the music seeped into the camp, gentle and persistent, as the women played their hearts out. It wasn't just music, it was a lifeline. The notes they strummed, the words they sang, brought joy, even if only for a fleeting moment. The laughter, the tears, the smiles, it was a stark contrast to the grim silence of the camp. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the prisoners allowed themselves to feel something other than despair. The camp, which had once felt like a place of only pain and loss, was slowly beginning to change. It was no longer just a prison, it was a space of shared experience, a space where they could find connection, not just through suffering, but through expression. They began to understand that their music was not just an escape, it was a reminder of who they were, of what they had been, and of what they could still become. Their performances were more than just a momentary distraction. The act of playing together, of singing together, became a quiet act of rebellion. Not a rebellion born of violence or defiance, but one that asserted their individuality, their agency. They weren't simply surviving, they were living. They weren't merely victims, they were creators. Music had given them the chance to reclaim their dignity, to find a voice in a place that had tried to silence them. and through the power of their music, the camp transformed. The same camp that had once felt like a symbol of their defeat now became a place where they could fight back, not with weapons, but with art. Their music became their resistance. Each song they played, each performance, was a declaration. We are still here. We are still human. They were not just women in captivity, they were women in harmony. And through their music, they would prove that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could still rise. The camp, once a suffocating cage, now felt like a place where they could breathe, where their music filled the air and allowed them to reclaim pieces of themselves that had been buried under the weight of war. But with every note they played, something else shifted. The women were no longer the only ones listening. The American soldiers, who had once been nothing more than faceless enemies, began to take notice. The initial surprise in their eyes turned into something else: curiosity. They had watched the women from afar, unsure of how to engage with these captives, these enemies who had been reduced to silent shadows. But now, as the sound of guitars and banjos drifted across the camp, the soldiers began to wonder about the women they had been ordered to guard. At first, the cultural divide between the women and their captors was painfully apparent. The women had been raised with a deep sense of honor, pride, and duty, where submission to the emperor's will was paramount. To them, the soldiers were the enemy, their very existence a threat to everything they had believed in. Meanwhile, the soldiers, having been trained to fight a war for a foreign land, looked at the women with a mixture of pity and disdain. They had been taught to see the Japanese as ruthless, obedient automatons, molded to fight for an empire that had turned its back on peace. And yet, in the midst of captivity, these women had picked up instruments, and music, something so foreign to their military minds, had become a bridge between them. The soldiers watched as the women struggled at first, hesitant, unsure whether the music was just another ploy to appease their captors or a genuine act of resistance. At first, the soldiers didn't understand it, didn't know how to interpret the sound, but as the weeks wore on, the music became something more than a distraction. It became a language, a universal language. Slowly, something started to change. The women, who had once been wary and distrustful of the soldiers, began to see the soldiers in a different light. They weren't just armed men in uniform, they were people too, caught up in the same war. And the soldiers, who had been trained to view their prisoners as less than human, began to see the women as individuals, each with a story, a talent, a history of their own. There came a moment when a soldier, his face hard from months of conflict, stood by the makeshift stage where the women had set up their instruments. He listened, his arms crossed, as they played a particularly haunting melody. The notes lingered in the air, and for the first time, the soldier didn't hear just the sound of foreign music. He heard the sorrow, the weight of loss, the pain of captivity, and perhaps even the hope for something better. When the song ended, he didn't just walk away like the others. He stayed. He nodded, slowly, and for a moment the two sides, captor and captive, understood one another. In that moment, the gap between the women and their captors narrowed. The music, once a reminder of the differences between them, had become a symbol of their shared humanity. The soldiers began to appreciate the women's adaptability, their ability to embrace something so outside their experience. And for the women, the music had shown them the vulnerability of their captors, their own struggles with the brutality of war, their own quiet wishes for peace. The lines between them blurred, and they were no longer captives and enemies. They were human beings, individuals caught in the same global tragedy, trying to survive, trying to find something to hold on to. Through music, they had found each other, and in the process, they had found their shared humanity. But as the days went on and their music became more fluid, more confident, something else began to shift. The songs they played, once full of simple joy and camaraderie, began to take on a new weight. The chords, once bright and light, now felt heavier. Each note seemed to carry a deeper sorrow, and the lyrics, which had once been easy to sing, now caught in their throats. The songs, simple as they were, began to trigger memories, memories of a life they had left behind, of families that had been torn apart by the war, of homes that had been reduced to rubble. The music, once a balm, now became a mirror, showing them not just their strength, but their pain. The past, once buried beneath the weight of survival, began to rise to the surface. For the women, the act of playing music had always been a way to escape, to find a moment of peace amid the chaos of captivity. But now, as they played, they were forced to face what they had lost. Each song was a reminder of their homeland, their families, and the lives that had been shattered by the war. The soft strum of the guitar echoed the emptiness they felt inside. The tender twang of the banjo reminded them of the family gatherings, the laughter of their siblings, and the quiet moments they had once taken for granted. And as the music swelled, so did their grief. It was a grief they hadn't allowed themselves to feel before, a grief that had been numbed by the brutality of war and the constant fight for survival. Now, in the quiet moments of the camp, the grief could no longer be ignored. The women struggled with this emotional burden. How could they reconcile the lives they had once lived with the lives they now had? How could they hold on to the memories of home without being consumed by the pain of those losses? The music, once a form of expression, now became a tool for navigating this complexity. It helped them process their grief, to allow the memories to come, but also to release them. Each song they played became an act of letting go, of finding a way to keep the past alive without letting it define them. Through the music, they began to understand that it was possible to remember, to grieve, and still move forward. In the midst of this emotional upheaval, the women also began to reclaim their identity. For so long, they had been defined by their roles as soldiers, as captives, as pieces in the machinery of war. But through the music, they began to rediscover who they were beyond those labels. The songs, with their themes of love, loss, and resilience, allowed them to see themselves not just as victims of circumstance, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and stories of their own. The music became an assertion of their humanity, a declaration that, even in the darkest of times, they were still whole. They were no longer defined by the war, by the loss of their homeland, or by the uniform they had worn. They were women with the same capacity for joy, sorrow, and expression as anyone else. And yet, as they played, there was also a constant tension, a duality of emotion that they could not escape. The music, beautiful and healing as it was, also carried with it the weight of their pain. With each joyful note, there was the echo of sorrow. With each moment of peace, there was the awareness of the chaos that still surrounded them. The women found themselves caught between these two worlds, the world of their past, full of love and loss, and the world of their present, where survival and hope were all they had left. Their music embodied this duality, this conflict between the joy they could still find and the pain they could not forget. It was a metaphor for their internal struggle, a struggle to live, to remember, and to move forward all at once. And so, through their songs, the women began to heal. They didn't forget the past. They couldn't. But through the music they learned to carry it with them, not as a weight that dragged them down, but as a part of who they were. It was a delicate balance, joy and sorrow, peace and conflict, and in that balance they began to find their way. It was during one of their impromptu performances, when the group had gathered in the corner of the camp's yard, that the first spark of recognition came. At first, it was just another routine, playing for themselves, for their fellow prisoners who had grown accustomed to their music. But this time, the sound of their guitars and banjos reached beyond the wire. A few American soldiers, stationed nearby, had stopped to listen, standing at the edge of the camp, their attention drawn by the haunting melodies. And then the unexpected happened. The camp's leadership took notice. It started with a simple request. Could they perform for the higher-ranking officers? The women exchanged cautious glances, unsure of what to make of this sudden attention. The same soldiers who had once been nothing more than distant figures behind rifles were now asking to hear their music. The invitation was not just a chance to perform, it was a turning point. It was the first time they felt that their music had become something more than just a form of self-expression. It had become a form of recognition. For the first time since their capture, they were seen not as prisoners or enemies, but as artists. The moment of recognition was a quiet but powerful revelation. They had always played to survive, to hold on to something of their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. But now they realized their music held a power they had never imagined. It wasn't just for them, it was for others too. It was a form of connection that could transcend the walls of the camp, something that reached beyond their own suffering to touch the hearts of those who listened. And as they prepared to perform for the officers, the realization hit them. Their art, their music, had given them something they hadn't known they needed: validation. The walls of the camp felt a little less confining now. The performance itself was a strange mix of apprehension and exhilaration. The women stood before the officers, their hands trembling slightly as they began to play. The officers, who had seen them as little more than captives for so long, now watched them as something else: creators, performers. In that moment, the music became more than just entertainment. It became a political statement. Through their willingness to embrace the American genre of country music, the women subtly shifted the narrative around them. They were not just surviving captivity, they were actively challenging the very concept of captivity itself. The performance echoed with the quiet defiance of their situation. To the officers, it wasn't just a musical performance. It was a symbol of the American ideals they had been fighting for. The women, by embracing this foreign genre, had made an unexpected act of resistance. Through music, they had reclaimed agency in a place designed to deny it. The country music they played, once mocked as a symbol of their enemies' inferiority, now became their weapon of choice, a way to assert their own identity and humanity in the face of captivity. As the applause of the officers echoed in their ears, the women understood that they had crossed a line. They were no longer just prisoners, they were performers, artists with a voice that could reach beyond their immediate surroundings. The music had transformed them, not just in the eyes of the soldiers, but in their own eyes. They were no longer passive victims of circumstance. They had embraced their role as artists, and with that, they had begun to change the very narrative of their captivity. Through their music, they had redefined what it meant to be a prisoner, and in that redefinition, they had found a sense of purpose that would carry them through the days ahead. The applause of the officers still echoed in their minds, but in the days that followed, something even more significant began to settle in. What had started as a simple way to pass the time, a fleeting escape from the harshness of captivity, was now something far more transformative. They were no longer just prisoners. The walls of the camp, once a suffocating symbol of their captivity, now seemed to stretch less tightly around them. In those moments when they picked up their instruments, they weren't merely surviving, They were creating. They were expressing something that was uniquely their own. They had crossed a threshold, and they couldn't unsee what they had become. Performers, artists, not just captives. The change was subtle at first. Their strumming was more deliberate, their voices stronger as they sang together. Each note was more than a sound. It was a declaration that they had not been broken, that they could still make choices about who they were. Music, once an act of survival, now became an assertion of their newfound power. They had control over their art, over their voice, over their lives, in ways they had never imagined before. They weren't at the mercy of their captors. They were shaping their own story. They were no longer mere subjects in the story of the war. They had begun to write their own narrative. This realization dawned slowly but surely. In the past, their survival had been about enduring, about waiting for something to change, about biding time until they were freed. But now there was a deeper understanding. They had begun to take ownership of their fate in a way they hadn't before. Their performances, their music, had given them a voice. It wasn't a loud, defiant voice that could challenge the forces around them, but it was a voice that allowed them to shape how they viewed themselves and their place in the world. They were still prisoners in the eyes of the world, but within the confines of the camp, they were free. They were creators. Through their music, the women began to heal. The act of playing had always offered them a form of release, but now it became a source of deep emotional recovery. As they played, they began to let go of the pain of the past, the trauma, the grief, the loss of their families, their homes, their old identities. The music gave them space to breathe, space to feel the weight of their emotions without being overwhelmed by them. They could express their sorrow through a song, their longing for the past through the strum of a guitar, and their hopes for the future through the uplifting notes of their voices. The music was not just a distraction, it was a way to process the complex emotions that had been building up inside them since their capture. The more they played, the more they embraced their new identities as musicians, as women capable of creating something beautiful, even in the most desperate of circumstances. They had found a way to reclaim parts of themselves that had been buried under the weight of war. They weren't just women who had lost everything, they were women who had found a way to rise again. Each song they played was a step toward healing, a step toward rebuilding their broken selves. Their transformation wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't even fully realized yet. But the seeds had been planted. Through their music they had begun to see the power they held within themselves. They had become more than captives, more than victims of the war. They had become creators, and in that they had found a new identity. One that no one, not even their captors, could take away from them. If you're enjoying this journey, make sure to like this video and leave a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. Your feedback and thoughts are invaluable, and we'd love to hear how this story resonates with you. But as the war came to its bitter end, the world outside the camp began to shift. The familiar sounds of war, the bombings, the marching, the clattering of rifles, gradually faded. The end of the conflict marked the beginning of their repatriation, a word that once seemed like a distant fantasy, now a reality they had to confront. As they were escorted out of the camp, the women felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. The physical chains that had bound them for so long were finally gone, but in their place were new, invisible chains. The weight of everything they had become while in captivity, and the uncertainty of how they would be received in a world that had moved on without them. The emotional impact of leaving the camp was profound. The camp, for all its suffering and confinement, had become a space of healing for the women. It was where they had rediscovered their identities, where they had reclaimed pieces of themselves that had been lost in the chaos of war. It was where they had learned to express their grief, their sorrow, and their hope through music, where they had found a community of women who understood their pain. The camp, in some strange way, had become home. Now, stepping beyond its wire gates felt like leaving behind the only place they had truly felt seen. The world outside seemed impossibly vast. The familiar landscapes of their homeland, the cities and towns that once felt like home, now seemed foreign, as though they no longer belonged there. The country they had once fought for had been reduced to rubble, and the people they had left behind had moved forward without them. What were they returning to? Were they even the same women who had left? The faces they once knew were now distant, unreachable. How could they explain what they had been through? How could they even begin to describe the transformation they had undergone? The music they had played, the way it had connected them to each other, to their humanity, seemed like a secret they couldn't share. The rest of the world couldn't possibly understand. The process of reintegration into society was far from easy. The world they returned to had changed in ways they couldn't have anticipated. They were no longer the same women who had left. Their minds had been altered by their captivity, and their hearts had been shaped by their time in the camp. The music, which had once been a tool of survival, had now become a reminder of everything they had lost. Yet, it also served as a quiet anchor to the women they had become, resilient, creative, and aware of their own strength. But how could they explain this to a society that hadn't witnessed their struggle, that hadn't heard their music? They felt as if they were speaking a language no one else could understand, and the silence around them was deafening. The impact of the music remained with them. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world outside became too much to bear, the melodies would play in their minds, offering them a sense of peace, a reminder of who they had become. It wasn't just the songs that had changed them. It was the act of creating something beautiful together, of finding solace in each other's presence. Their music had become a thread that tied them to their past, to their fellow prisoners, and to the strength they had found within themselves. They had learned to survive, but more than that, they had learned to live. And now, even as they stepped into a world that seemed impossibly foreign, they carried that music with them, knowing that it would always be a part of them, an indelible mark of their transformation. Returning home was not what they had imagined. The landscape, once so familiar, now felt distant, like a place they had never truly known. Their journey back was marked by silence, the kind that comes with profound change. As the train rumbled through the countryside, they passed villages that had once been lively, now reduced to smoldering ruins. The homes that had once been filled with warmth and laughter were now nothing more than memories. The faces of the people they had known, their families, seemed like ghosts in their minds. The world they had left behind was gone, replaced by something that felt foreign and unrecognizable. The war had torn through everything they once knew, and now they had to find a way to fit back into this broken world. The women, changed in ways they could not fully comprehend, had to reconcile their captivity with the world outside. The music that had once been a refuge, a way to survive in the camp, now served as a reminder of the transformation they had undergone. It wasn't just the songs they had learned, it was what those songs had meant to them, what they had given them. The music had shown them that there was still beauty, even in the darkest places. It had taught them that they could still find joy, still find peace, and still reclaim pieces of themselves that had been lost. But the world outside the camp was no longer the world they had left. They saw things differently now. What had once seemed ordinary now seemed strange. What had once been important now seemed insignificant. The war had reshaped their perspective, and with it, their understanding of the world. They could no longer look at the world through the same lens they once had. The women who returned were not the same as the ones who had left. Their time in captivity had changed them. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also discovered the depths of their own resilience. Through their music, they had found a way to survive, to connect with each other, and to heal. They no longer saw themselves as victims. They had found their strength, their agency, and their creativity. But now, as they stepped into the world they had once known, they had to figure out where they fit. The change in perspective was not easy to navigate. They could no longer ignore the complexities of the world, nor could they escape the memories of what they had endured. Yet, in the midst of it all, they found comfort in the music they had played. It was a connection to their past, a way to carry forward the lessons they had learned. The songs that had once helped them survive now became part of the foundation for their new lives. The influence of country music in their lives lingered long after their return. It had been a constant thread throughout their captivity, and it now served as a lifeline in their post-war lives. The music, which had once been so foreign to them, had become a means of connection, a bridge between their past and their future. It was a reminder of the resilience they had found within themselves and of the strength they had discovered in each other. As they reintegrated into society, the women found that their music had not only helped them heal, it had also helped them understand others. The world had changed, but the music remained a steady companion, one they could always turn to when they needed solace, connection, or a reminder of who they had become. Their lives after the war were filled with challenges, but the lessons they had learned in captivity stayed with them. They knew now that they could never go back to the way things had been, but that didn't mean they couldn't move forward. The music they had once mocked had become their strength. It had taught them to be creators, not just survivors. It had helped them heal, but it had also reshaped the way they viewed the world. They had been forever changed by the war, but they had also been forever marked by the music that had helped them reclaim their humanity. And as they moved into this new chapter of their lives, they carried that music with them, finding peace and strength in it. It had once seemed strange, even laughable, but now it was their anthem, one they would carry with them, always. If you've enjoyed this story, please like the video and leave a comment below saying where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.